All right, kiddos, we're finishing up 1966 at a glance. We're going to have a review tomorrow and a test Wednesday. What happened on September 17th of 1966? Willie Mays. This guy right here. Say hey kid, Willie Mays. Hit his 535th career home run. Willie Mays of the San Francisco Giants. The Say Hey Kid, that's what they called him. Hit his 535th home run. And Caitlin's saying, so what? It was September 17th. What would be the significance of his 535th home run? Do you think? Anybody? Not yet. He moves into second place all time. Who held the record? Babe Ruth. Very good. Which will soon get broke by steroid-using losers. But anyway, that's another topic. So, on September 17th, Willie Mays of the San Francisco Giants hit his 535th home run to move into second place among career home run hitters. Right behind Babe Ruth. Which takes me on a soapbox. I could go for hours on how tainted baseball's records are now with the steroid age, but we'll skip that. Okay, October 5th. You can never get away from it. October 5th, 1966. The Texas Court of Appeals overturned the conviction of Jack Ruby in the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald. And what did they order, Josh? You were really? Oh, thank you! A retrial. So on October 5th of 1966, the Texas Court of Appeals overturned the conviction of Jack Ruby in the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald and ordered a retrial. November 8th of 1966, Ronald Wilson Reagan, the ruggedly handsome former movie actor turned politician, was elected governor of California. November 8th, 1966, Ronald Wilson Reagan, the ruggedly handsome former movie star turned politician, was elected governor of California. He was just 55 years old at the time, a conservative Republican. He wins his first attempt at ever running for political office. Becomes governor of California, which paves the way for what? The presidency later. Very good. November 8th, Ronald Wilson Reagan, former actor turned politician, is elected governor of California. The 55-year-old conservative Republican was successful in his first ever attempt at running for any political office. Obviously will pave the way in later years for him to be president of the United States. All right, this is a big one. December 12th, 1966. Bruised and weary. Francis Chichester was helped ashore in Sydney, Australia. December 12, 1966, bruised and weary, Francis Chichester was helped ashore in Sydney, Australia. Anybody want to guess what he was doing? Well, close. He had just completed the longest solo sea voyage in history. He had just completed the longest solo sea voyage in history. Completed the largest solo sea voyage in history. Traveled 13,750 miles in 107 days. Solo. Gutsy, wouldn't it? Traveled 13,750 miles in 107 days. I'd like to be on the sea yourself for 107 days and traveled 13,750 miles, as unpredictable as the ocean can be. You don't have to write this down, but listen. The 65-year-old British adventurer and magazine publisher received a hero's welcome on his arrival from Plymouth, England, on his 53-foot boat. Not very big. Sydney was at the halfway point of the original planned voyage, but after swinging a glass of English beer, he vowed, "I shall go on." So halfway there, he swigged a glass of English beer and vowed he shall go on. He completed 13,750 miles in 107 days in a 53-foot boat. Who would do that? You think about that, I think that would be incredibly dangerous. But he did it, and he was 65 years old. Okay, that's going to take us to basically our last discussion, which is going to be the Apollo space program, which will include Apollo 1 specifically and Apollo 8 specifically. Okay? So we're going to talk about the Apollo space program. Now, I mentioned this before, so write it down if you would like. The Apollo was the United States space program that carried man to the moon. And it actually began in 1961, following Gemini, and it ended in 1975. So there were several Apollo flights between 1961 and 1975, and of course the one we remember the most is Apollo 11, which carried Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, although Michael Collins stayed above the moon and orbited the command module. But Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin both set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong becoming the first. During that time period of 1961 to 1975, I don't know if you knew this or not, but did you know that 12 astronauts landed on the moon during that time? We only remember the first. But there were actually 12 astronauts that set foot on the moon during the Apollo series from 1961 to 1975. A 14-year period, they did have 12 different men set foot on the moon. And what I want to do kind of is explain what the Apollo rocket was. It was called Saturn V. Saturn V. I've got one up here, very tiny. I'll show you kind of what it amounted to. This is what the Saturn rocket looked like on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy. Okay? Now really there's a very small part of this whole thing that ever gets to the moon. Okay? Just barely the top up here. We'll show you. So this is basically what it looked like, the Saturn V rocket, when it takes off. Now once it separates and gets into space, it looks like this, and this is, like Chera said, the very top of the rocket, okay? And it consists of three pieces. The command module, which is the very top piece here, the command module, right here. The surface module, which is this part right here, which services the command module. And what's inside the service module? Anybody want to know? You got to take a guess? What's inside that? It's called the lunar module. That's the thing that kind of looks like a caterpillar that ends up going down onto the moon. It's inside here. So at the very top of that Saturn V rocket that takes off from Cape Canaveral, this is the main guts of the whole thing. And this just happens to be a model of Apollo 8, which we'll talk about. Command module, service module, and inside the service module is going to be the lunar module. Can you picture what that looks like? It looks like the caterpillar. Okay, it's got legs. Well, what happens is this module is going to come out of here, and what are they going to do? They're going to dock, and the astronauts that are going to go to the moon are going to be attached to the lunar module, and they're going to go from the command module into the lunar module. It's going to separate, and the lunar module is going to go down to the moon, and the command module is going to stay above the moon's surface. And then the lunar module is going to come back up, jettison back up, dock. They're going to discard the lunar module, and the command module is what's going to go back home. Okay? And that's what basically the Apollo ship looks like. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it gives you a little bit of an idea what you're dealing with here. Okay, a little different than Gemini and much different than Mercury. The command module, I'll tell you a little bit about each one. The command module was a small 3-seat capsule, and each of the Apollo missions carried 3 men. So the command module was small 3-seat capsule. There's 3 seats in the top of that. And it was basically the living quarters and the control center for the astronauts. That's where everything happened. And as I mentioned, that was also the module that returned the astronauts back to Earth. Okay, the rest of that long Saturn V rocket was discarded. Okay? Now, the service module, which I talked about, was simply the one that sat behind the capsule, the command module, and it carried the engines along with the thrusters that controlled the craft's flight to the moon. And it provided the electricity and the oxygen and the water to the command module as they went to the moon. And if you've ever heard about the ill-fated Apollo 13, that was the problem in 13 when they were going to the moon. They stirred the oxygen tanks and they had a short, and their oxygen was leaving the command module, which caused a lot of troubles aboard the mission and made them come back home. It also carries the fuel. Okay? The lunar module was built to take 2 astronauts down to the lunar surface and back to the orbit. And we'll talk more about that later. That's the caterpillar-looking instrument that actually went to the moon's surface. Now, on the first Apollo 11, they didn't have this, but 3 of the Apollo missions carried an LRV as well, which was a lunar roving vehicle, or basically a 4-wheeler on steroids, that they rode on the surface of the moon. So we remember Apollo mainly for the Apollo 11 moon landing, you know, 1 small step for man, 1 giant step for mankind. But there was a lot of things that happened in the Apollo space program that was kind of cool. You'll have an astronaut we'll talk about that took a golf club, Sherman, and hit a golf ball on the moon. And you'll see that golf club in the National Air and Space Museum if that interests you. So Apollo was kind of a real complicated thing. And more than just the moon landing. As I mentioned, they actually had a 4-wheeled moon buggy that actually they drove on the surface of the moon in later missions. But let's talk about Apollo 1, and then we'll quit for the day. I'm not sure what time this period ends today, but it's got to be getting close. 10:19, we might get a little farther than that. But Apollo 1. Anybody know what happened on Apollo 1? Anybody know that story? We'll tell you. Kind of. Caitlin said it blew up. She's kind of right. Well, on January 27th of 1967, January 27th of 1967, the Apollo program suffered a pretty early disaster in Apollo 1. That's like the first one, okay? We had a very big space disaster on January 27th, 1967. On Apollo 1. Here are the 3 astronauts that were killed in this disaster. One should ring a bell. First one was Roger Chaffee, who's on your ID sheet. The second one was Edward H. White II. And the third one is why I do not have all 7 Mercury astronauts' autographs on my door, because the 3rd astronaut killed was Virgil Gus Grissom, who should be familiar to you because he flew in the Mercury and Gemini missions, but we know him more for Mercury. Because he died at such an early age, his signature is worth lots of money. Why? The reason I do not have one. Well, what happened, the 3 were killed in a flash fire that engulfed the Apollo 1 command module. They all died in a flash fire. The Saturn V rocket was on the launch pad. They were doing a simulation or a practice because they were going to launch on February 21st. They had a short and a fire engulfed the command module. The astronauts were trapped behind the closed hatches. They were unable to use the escape system because it was blocked by a frame structure around the hatches because it was still on the launch pad. They tried to get emergency crews in there to get the 3 astronauts, but they were blocked by the dense smoke that reeled out of the cabin. And unfortunately and disastrously, and I can't imagine, all 3 were burned to death on the launch pad inside the command module. We will visit both Roger Chaffee and Gus Grissom's grave sites at Arlington. That's where they are buried. We will take a little trip up there and honor them with an American flag on their gravesite, and you'll see where those 2 men, where their final resting places were from Apollo 1. But that was a really tough start for the Apollo program. And it continued, and the one that we'll talk about next that was most important was Apollo 8, because what Apollo 8 did is it set the stage for the moon landing. Without Apollo 8, we have no Apollo 11. So Apollo 8 will set the stage for the moon landing. Apollo 8 was launched on December 21st, 1968. It was launched on December 21st, 1968. Apollo 8 was commanded by a familiar name we talked about, Frank Borman, commanded Apollo 8. Another familiar name we talked about, Jim Lovell, was his command module pilot, which means he's going to be flying what? Obviously, the command module. And William Anders was tabbed as the lunar module pilot. So Apollo 8, the whole mission was commanded by Frank Borman. Jim Lovell will be the command module pilot in Apollo 8. And William Anders is going to be the lunar module pilot. Now, what's the lunar module again? The one that looks like the caterpillar? Only on this mission, they're not going to have a lunar module because this is going to be a simulation of trying to make sure that they can get the Apollo craft around the moon. Okay? Because if they can't get around the moon, they can't land on the moon, and you can't have an Apollo 11. So this is a very, very important. So they had a mission that consisted of 4 things. Remember, the command module and the lunar module are going to have to be able to stay in space. And so they want, you don't have to really write these down. They want to evaluate the command module and service module in lunar orbit. They want to evaluate crew performance in a lunar orbit mission. They want to demonstrate communications and tracking from Earth to the moon. And they wanted to return high-resolution photography of a proposed landing area. So the whole purpose of the mission, in short, was to be able to get around the moon successfully, because if they could not do that, and they had never done that before, they couldn't get to the moon and land. That was the main thing. And they also were going to take photographs of the moon's surface to pinpoint a place that Apollo 11 would actually land when they did come to the moon for the lunar landing. Does that make sense? That was the whole purpose of the mission right there. So again, since they weren't going to land on the moon, they didn't have a lunar module on this flight. Apollo 8 was in flight for 68 hours, 58 minutes, and 45 seconds. You could write down almost 69 hours. Okay? They're in flight for almost 69 hours, 68 hours, 58 minutes, and 45 seconds. Well, Apollo 8 passed behind the moon, first time that any astronauts had been behind the moon. So Borman, Lovell, and Anders became the first human beings to see the moon's far side. Okay, Pink Floyd, the far side of the moon. Anyway, so they become the first astronauts to see the other side, so to speak, of the moon. The far side of the moon. There were 6 audio and video telecasts that were conducted during the mission. In other words, 6 times these astronauts either talked back to Mission Control at Houston or actually sent a video back of what they were doing, which was kind of a new thing. We take it for granted now. It was a pretty big deal to have a video telecast back home. Probably the most famous of those 6 audio or video telecasts were on Christmas Eve of 1968, on the 24th. It's kind of cool. That evening, Borman, Lovell, and Anders each read verses from the first chapter of Genesis during that live broadcast. And they completed their live broadcast by wishing viewers, quote, "Good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." So probably the most famous of those video audio broadcasts was on Christmas Eve, when they actually read verses from the first chapter of Genesis and wished viewers a good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. The re-entry speed of Apollo 8 was 25,000 miles per hour as they headed towards splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. And they splashed down on December 27th, 1968, a very successful mission. December 27th, 1968. The launch and the descent and the splashdown was precisely on time. They were exactly on time, which is really unusual. And Apollo 8 actually included 10 orbits around the moon. They went around the moon 10 times. And it's absolutely paved the way to the successful moon landing that would occur on July 20th of 1969. Without Apollo 8, there is no